Well, thank you, and let me begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation on whose land we stand. Let me say you are very brave coming out tonight. It's great weather for Baptists. We have a kink for water. I didn't know if Anglicans, who are sparing with water, would come out, but here you are. And the fact that you're here is a tribute to Tony, and to Tony and Liz, and to Ben and Daniel, their sons who are here tonight. The venue, perhaps a bit small, a bit chilly, but in terms of the moral and spiritual significance of what is being launched tonight and the work that's behind this, there is no more fitting setting than a cathedral because of this spiritual and moral, really, revolution that began with Tony and Liz's vision. So thank you for being witnesses to that revolution which is creating such hope, livelihood, regeneration and ripple effect right across the globe. So on a night that's freezing, I hope you'll remember that you were here and were in the cheer squad for what I think is an extraordinary, not just agricultural revolution, but really spiritual revolution in terms of reminding us that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, that all species carry the imprint of God, humans the image of God, but everything else carries also the imprint of God. And this comes out in both the faith, the vision, and the work of Tony Rinaudo. So glad the presenter referred to the globe behind us. You couldn't get a better image. I've been here doing refugee announcements and have seen it before. I'm glad that it's still behind me because from outer space, you can get satellite pictures now of the globe, but when they home in, they will show you in Niger and now in other places. In Niger, pre-Tony Rinaudo and post-Tony Rinaudo. They will literally show you the greening of a Sahel desert area and the extraordinary impact where Niger, always food dependent, World Food Programme every year having to rescue Niger because it's so arid, not enough food's produced, can't feed its own. Thanks to Tony's work, Niger being now a supplier of food to the World Food Programme. When you think of that in such a poor country, you realise just the depths and the impact and the moral and spiritual significance of this work. When I read this book, I was fascinated to actually realise that Giuseppe Rinaudo, who migrated from Australia to Sicily, settling up in Myrtleford, being a tobacco farmer, I immediately thought, can anything good come out of Sicily? Well, Giuseppe did, and his son Tom and his son Tony. And the spiritual sensitivity of Tony growing up, seeing commercial farming, cutting down of trees, wondering why in Australia this was happening. That being the foundation for his questioning, his reading of Scripture, his understanding that creation carries the imprint of God and it's to be valued and esteemed and it is to flourish as humans are to flourish. The wonderful early chapters with pictures in this beautifully produced book are just amazing. The stories with SIM in Niger, stories I've heard Tony tell many times, beautifully presented in this book. That despair, utter despair, thinking I failed as an agriculturalist. Why am I here? Trying to plant trees which never survive. Why am I here? Asking that question as he's changing a tyre, looking out at an arid landscape and reflecting on the sheer hopelessness when he'd felt a call, as had Liz. And Liz was actually probably more up for this call initially than Tony to go to Africa. A call to be there, and now despair, pointlessness, hopelessness. Why? And as Tony is changing that tyre, feeling the despair, having really a revelation, a divine moment, seeing that around on almost a lunar landscape, tree stumps, maybe with a few sprouts, a bit of bush, always cut down, burnt away, cleared for farming as the culture was in Niger. And the penny dropping, if there is a tree stump with a few sprouts, that means that tree stump is not dead. And looking at the number of them, that means there's a root system. And with this number, this many, that means there's an underground forest, the title of this book. And if there's an underground forest, then maybe, rather than just planting trees, there's another way. There's a way of, with just a knife that every farmer has in Niger, of pruning away the weakest sprouts, as we've all done in our gardens, preserving the strongest, protecting them with a dug well around for any precipitation, teaching farmers not to let their animals graze while this sprouting tree starts to kick back into gear. Like an engine in neutral, the tree stumps get into gear and start growing. And then the foliage itself becomes fertiliser, and the birds and the foliage with their fertiliser, and the precipitation patterns when there's tree cover, greater rain patterns. And then perhaps the greatest challenge of all, culture change, behavioural change, to actually teach farmers that they've got to change their ways. Anyone knows that culture is the long tail behind so many failed attempts at doing good. Culture is a very long tail. To try and change it produces resistance and charges of interfering and devaluing. As Tony put it, I had no doubt that I had found the solution, the discovery of the underground forest. But it didn't take Niger by storm. In fact, acceptance of FMNR was slow at first. The paradigm of being a good farmer, being a clean farmer, one who clears trees from his land, was deeply ingrained. And nobody in that culture wanted to be seen to be questioning or going against the accepted wisdom. Farmers had been clearing trees for generations, and most could not see the wisdom in allowing trees to grow in their valuable fields. Or, even if they did, because they didn't own the trees, they knew that it was more likely than not that someone would steal them, so why bother? He then goes on to talk about the issue of tree ownership and tackling that head on, to give farmers an interest in nurturing and caring for trees and being able to then have trees where you could lop off a branch, sell it, firewood, and have an income. Trees that, without destroying them, could be a cash crop rather than weeds and a liability. Well, Tony's going to speak. He speaks much more eloquently than me about this work. All I can say is that having followed Tony to some of the desolate places of the earth, Ethiopia, where some of the oldest churches and villages, oldest churches on the planet, were seeing their people leave the village, desert the church, them crumbling, their way of life absolutely folding, until farmer-managed natural regeneration taught them about tree regeneration, about how you deal with soil and protect it, and water streams that are very, very fragile. Following Ethiopian farmers, who I couldn't understand a word of, but hearing them intermittently saying, "Tony Rinaudo, Tony Rinaudo," like Moses in the desert following Tony Rinaudo to a promised land, which was their land, their recovery of their culture, their ancient churches, that they had a future in this village, that their children had a future in this village because of this spiritual, moral, agricultural application. And I really want to finish by saying in launching this book that I've never really understood the words of Jesus when he said, "The meek will inherit the earth," until I met Tony. Tony actually is a very meek person. I have never been accused of being meek. I wish someone would, but I've never been accused of being meek. Tony is a very meek, humble person. He's a person so softly spoken, well, I shouldn't say this, Tony, on first impression, so underwhelming. You go, oh, well, I'll move on to someone who's got a bit of sizzle. Tony is, by personality, a very meek person. So when I first started hearing about what he was doing, it was hard to actually take it in because he is so humble. When I followed Tony to parts of the world, seeing him work with the meekest of the earth, literally of the earth, their livelihood, their culture, their kids depended on the earth, I suddenly started to understand what Jesus meant when he said, "The meek shall inherit the earth." Tony, you have helped me understand some of the Beatitudes. This book, which I'm commanding you all to buy at the end, I'm not inviting you, I'm commanding you to buy, The Forest Underground, is an absolutely profound story. I'm very, very pleased to launch it. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Tim. I'm so thankful that it was you introducing me, and it's so appropriate. From the start, Tim's been a great supporter of myself and my work, and carved time out of his very, very busy schedule to come twice to international conferences we'd organised in Africa, to open those conferences and participate. So wonderful to have you here tonight, Tim. Thank you. And greetings, everyone. I'm really, really humbled that you'd come out on such a cold, miserable night just to hear me speak. Thank you for coming. I'm so happy. I've always thought that book launches and signings were pretty remote, sterile kind of occurrence in unfamiliar settings. But imagine, my own granddaughter's here. I'm so happy that you came, Allegra. There's somebody here, he's the older brother of my best friend when I was 5, grew up 2 doors from me in Myrtleford, northeast Victoria. There's people from my serving in mission, SIM family. Liz and I were members of that family for 17 years, and it's just wonderful to see you here. Past and present people from World Vision. And a special shout out to the Dream Team, the lovely people that I work with in World Vision who are taking this approach, farmer managed natural regeneration, further and higher than what I could ever have done. So wonderful to have you here. My church family, old friends, very, very new friends, and a shout out to Simone who's watching but unfortunately couldn't be here, and friends that I'm about to meet very, very soon. So for me, it's a very intimate and happy occasion, and it's in this venue, a place of faith and prayer, and very much this story is a story of faith. Yes, weak faith and often faltering faith, but nevertheless faith. And it's a story unambiguously and unapologetically of answered prayer. So very, very appropriate venue. And then the backdrop. I didn't organise this, but could you ask for a better backdrop? The beautiful earth that we live on, intricate, interconnected, but so vulnerable, that scaffolding upon which all life on earth depends, our life support system that we so heedlessly, thoughtlessly trash and use once and throw out like so many old rags, not giving it a thought, expecting it to give and give and give without giving back. I think it's very, very appropriate that that's our backdrop. So I was blessed to grow up in northeast Victoria. I climbed many of the trees close to our house. I walked over the hills that surround that little town. I swam and fished in the river and drank from that river. And it was a very, very happy childhood. And I remember every Sunday after Mass, and then we'd have a traditional Italian meal. Mum and Dad would pile us into the car and we'd head off to Wangaratta, where my grandparents lived. And for the first 8-10 kilometres, the trees come all the way from the tops of the hills to the very edge of the road. And then as you approach the Beechworth turn-off, the country opens out and bang, this bald Mamungi Ranges hits you in the eyes before you. And I'd be there in my mind's eye, gumboots, shovel in hand, I'd be up on that hill planting trees, thinking, why on earth did the farmers have to take out every tree? Yes, we need to grow food, yes, we need production, but was it necessary to destroy all the trees and leave that hill so bare and vulnerable to erosion? And so I guess there were three major things that shaped me at that time and to this day as well. And one was the destruction of that bushland that I love so much. And steep hills were bulldozed, the land was left fallow for years on end. And even as a child, I didn't understand ecology, but it didn't add up to me. The loss of biodiversity, the erosion, the higher temperatures. Tobacco was the main crop in that district. And in the earlier years, they used to spray DDT and other chemicals from aeroplanes, and the drift would go into the rivers that I loved. Every now and then, big trout would float down belly up. So that had a really big impact on me, and I wondered what was wrong with the adults in this world. Was short-term profit so important that you were willing to destroy everything in order to get it? The second thing that shaped me was I would watch the news, I'd read the papers, and children just like me who through no fault of their own were going to bed hungry. They happened to be born elsewhere, and in our district we were growing tobacco. Again, it didn't make sense. And then significantly, the third thing, my mum was a very patient, long-suffering woman, but it was her faith. And I think it gave me a framework for life, that there was more to life than material possessions and financial security, that we did have a duty of care, of responsibility for those less fortunate for ourselves, and that we were responsible for caring for creation. So those things were deeply ingrained in my thinking. And that was my picture of the adult world. And I think I was a very angry child, very frustrated because I felt powerless, but I couldn't do anything about it. But I did the one thing that a child could do, and I threw up this child's prayer. Please, God, use me somehow, somewhere to make a difference. And I've tried to be true to that prayer all my life. One day I was visiting the local farmers with my dad. Dad owned a machinery shop, and he did a lot of repairs in the local district. And we were visiting a Yugoslav friend, a migrant. It was off-season, so his tobacco shed was empty. And there in the middle of this shed, unceremoniously dumped, was a whole trailer load of clearance library books. Just a nondescript pile of old books. And two dull green, there was no photos on the cover, dull green books. Almost, they seemed to have leapt out to me. I don't know why I grabbed those two out of the pile, but they were written by a very eccentric and very, very interesting British forester, self-proclaimed protector of the world's forests, Richard St. Barbie Baker. And the first book was My Life, My Trees, and the second was Sahara Conquest. And I read those books from cover to cover, and I took courage. This is something that I could aspire to. There were adults in the world that were trying to do the right thing, and those seeds were sown by that forester. I went on to study agriculture at university. I thought I'd better be useful if I'm going to make any difference wherever I end up going. But when I got to university, I'm not a natural student. I really struggled to be there. I was lonely, 600 kilometres from home, and these doubts would creep in. Who do you think you are? What difference do you think you could make on a world scale? And it really flattened me. And it was around that time that I got into the habit of reading a little bit from God's Word every morning. And this verse from Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10 really stuck in my mind. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared that we should walk in them. God prepared them beforehand. And I just took courage. I didn't know where or how or when, but it no longer mattered. That promise was sufficient. And I knew that the first step was I needed to have that degree under my belt. And when I got to the end of that, I'd be able to see further. And there's a saying, go as far as you can see. And when you get there, you'll always be able to see further. And that's been our experience. We didn't know what we were going to see in Niger. We didn't know how we were going to solve any problems, and we struggled. But you go as far as you can, and you'll always be able to see the next step. I never thought I would meet a woman mad enough to want to live with me in a mud hut in the middle of Africa. But I was wrong. There was at least one. And Liz was in the same course as I was, rural science. And we're soul buddies. Liz was an answer to prayer, and this is a joint calling. She's been beside me and supporting me and putting the wheels back on the cart every time they came off all this time. So it's a tribute to you, Liz. Thank you, and you're really, really special. I'm the one that gets all the recognition and the awards, but it really is a team effort. So we joined a missionary organisation, SIM, or Serving in Mission, and we were assigned to Niger Republic in West Africa, borderland of the Sahara Desert, landlocked country, one of the poorest countries in the world. And as agricultural graduates with really no practical experience, the landscape that confronted us when we arrived there floored us. There's nothing that could have prepared us for that. It was at the point of ecological collapse, a landscape that was barely able to support life on Earth. And yet, in my short lifetime, we're only in our very early 20s back then, within that period, it had been a biodiverse dryland forest with wildlife, with springs of water, with relatively fertile soils that supported the local population. In just 20 to 30 years, it had been reduced to that, partly because of climate change. We didn't know that then, but the whole West Africa region has experienced a 25 to 30% step down in average rainfall. But I would argue mostly because of excessive land clearing. A good farmer, in the mentality, a good farmer is a clean farmer. And it mirrors our own Australian adage, if it moves, if it moves, shoot it. If it doesn't, chop it down. That was the attitude. But it had devastating impacts, increasing severity and frequency of droughts. In the rains, in the years that it did rain, there's no guarantee of getting a crop, because without the biodiversity, the natural insect-eating birds, the spiders and so on, the pest numbers built up, and you could still lose your entire crop. In a normal year, we have a 4-month rainy season and 8 months totally dry. If you get drought on top of that, it's absolutely devastating, not just for the crops, but for the livestock. So people really, really suffered. And everybody suffered, but the ones that suffered the most were the women and the children. It became harder and harder to source wood. In some instances, people walking 2, 3, even 4 hours just to collect their fuel wood. In many cases, there simply wasn't any, and they would collect all of the straw, the crop residue from their millet crops. In the absence of that, they would sweep up whatever manure they could get. Cow manure, yes, but most people didn't own cows back then. Imagine the indignity of sweeping up goat pellets and using that for your cooking fuel. Water tables dropped. It became harder and harder to draw water. Many of the wells there were 20, 40, 60, the further you go north, even 100 metres deep, and so on and so forth. Very, very hard life, particularly for women and children. And there was I, the agricultural graduate, turned up. I was going to change the world. What a shock. But in my mind, if deforestation was one of the root causes of all these problems, presto, we just need to get trees back into this landscape. Much, much easier said than done. And I read widely, I consulted the experts, we experimented, planting before the rains with a little bit of irrigation, planting exotic species, indigenous species, guarding with fences, guarding with live armed guards and so on. Nothing worked in a sustainable, economically viable or satisfying way. Probably 80 to 90% of those trees died. And as if that wasn't bad enough to add injury to insult, people called me the crazy white farmer. Who in their right mind would devote their valuable farmland to trees? We're hungry, we need income to put our kids in school and so on. And here's this crazy white farmer comes and tells us we should devote some of our land to trees. It was absolute nuts, nonsense. And so you can imagine, at that age, what were we, Liz, 23, 24, you're pretty eager to leave your mark on a place and say, this is what I achieved and so on. And we weren't achieving anything. It was just total waste of time and money. And it would have been very, very easy to give up and go home. I got so discouraged. And I remember on one particular day, and I happened to have a ute load of trees with a trailer full of trees as well. And we pulled out into the countryside, very sandy, deep, sandy roads, so I had to stop and reduce the air pressure. And I just stood up after I reduced the pressure so I wouldn't get bogged, and looked in every direction, north, south, east, west. Barely a tree in sight, and thought, how many $1 million would it take? How many decades? How many hundred staff? This is hopeless. Better to give up and go home. And the weaker side of me thought, God, you could have made a fool of me in Australia. You didn't have to bring me all the way out here to do that. But I thought, no, we've had this sense of calling to be here. God doesn't make mistakes. There must be a solution. And the strange thing is, I'd been on this track almost weekly for 2.5 years, eyes open, but totally blind to what had been all around us that whole time. And on this particular day, I'd stopped to reduce the air pressure. This useless-looking bush, could have been a desert bush, could have been an agricultural weed for all I knew. This bush caught my attention, and I took the trouble to walk over and have a closer look. And of course, as soon as you see the leaf of a tree is like a signature. You can tell from there, that's not a wattle, it's something else. It's like a signature, and in that instant, everything changed. It's not a bush, it's not a weed, it's a tree. And it's been cut down, and it's trying desperately to grow again, but the normal farming practice is to slash it. But that was the turning point for me. And I realized that the battle lines had shifted. I wasn't fighting the Sahara Desert. It wasn't a technological or a financial problem that I was trying to solve. This was about mindset. If it was false beliefs about the value of trees and nature, and negative attitudes, and certainly destructive practices that brought the landscape to its knees, barely able to support life. If that was what had brought us here, then that was the true battle. And of course, when you understand what the real root cause of the problem is, your whole approach changes. And there's some marketing people here and media people. They at my expense, they call me all kinds of names: the forest maker, the tree whisperer, and so on. Ignore them. That's total nonsense. 95% of what I do is regreening mindscapes in order to regreen landscapes. And if I win that battle, can we work with nature instead of fighting it and destroying it all the time? Everything that you need is literally at your feet. If I win that battle, the rest is relatively easy. And I call this discovery the underground forest, because when you cut a tree down, for most species, perhaps not for pines or cypress, but certainly for our gum trees, and you would have seen this, and the same thing after bushfires, the whole trunk becomes a profusion of sprouts. For most species, you cut a tree down, and I need you to imagine that this is a tree stump and it's resprouting from the stump. It's not the end of the tree's life. And if it had been 10, 15 metres in the air above ground, then it'll have 10, 15 metres of roots below ground. So you've got 30 to 50% of the biomass of the tree sitting there like Tim's V8 engine. It's turned on, but it's idling. It wants a chance to regrow into a tree, but we keep suppressing it, cutting, burning, ploughing, grazing. And that's where the battle is. Can we alter human behaviour so that we give what's already there, what God's given us, a chance to regrow? And so this method came to be known, very awkward but extremely appropriate, farmer-managed natural regeneration. It is what it says. It's not Tony managed, it's not World Vision or SIM managed, it's farmer managed or community managed or pastoralist managed, deliberately so, because they will manage that regrowth according to their needs. And because it's meaningful to them, I don't have to pay them, I don't have to lay down regulations, they do it because it will meet their needs. And I'd better just give a little quick demonstration of what it looks like. So when you cut a tree, often there'll be a dozen, maybe even 2 dozen stems that came up. If we do nothing, eventually that will become a tree if it's not pounded with fire and livestock and so on. But if we prune the excess so there's less competition for space and light and moisture and nutrients, if we reduce the competition, all that energy and water is going to go into the selective few shoots. They'll grow faster and taller, they'll be more robust. So the first thing we want to do is cut the weak ones, the crooked ones, the broken ones, and select the very strongest, the most robust. And I deliberately didn't bring my secateurs. I've never given anybody secateurs to do this because I don't want farmers coming to me and saying, well, you gave one to Joe down the road, I can't do this because you didn't help me too. And the same thing with fencing. I've never paid for fencing, and I've had the World Bank dispute this. You can't do a forestry project without fencing out the livestock. Well, even the World Bank doesn't have enough money to restore the vast area of degraded land around the world. It has to be social fencing. I do this, I protect this because it's in my best interest, not because you pay me, not because you put up a fence. And all I'm going to do is reduce the excess, cut some of the side branches up to about a third or so of the way up the trunk and make a nice mess in St. Paul's Cathedral. Hope they don't kick me out. So the one's sticking out the side. I could leave just one, but the problem is, can you still hear me? Yeah. The problem is in a very poor society where not oil, but wood is your energy currency. You need wood for cooking, for heating, for building, for trading and everything else. If I just left one, the next day it would be gone. But if I encourage people to leave up to 5 and say each year we could cut the biggest one and use that, leave a replacement to grow up in its place. The next year, the second one will be that much bigger and we'll harvest that. And the third year, the next one, and so on. And we have a rotation going. And in many cases, people eventually do leave just one, but instead of cutting that down at the base and getting back to a denuded landscape, they'll select some of the branches, maybe a third of the branches each year, allowing them to regrow, and then the next year they cut another third, and so on. So even in that just 2-3 minutes that it took me, it's already starting to transition from looking like a bush to starting to look like perhaps that could be a tree. So, embarrassingly simple, but it works. Bill Mollison, co-founder of permaculture, said the solutions to the world's increasingly complex problems are embarrassingly simple. And FMNR is embarrassingly simple. I can't even claim that I invented it. It's not even new. It's something that's been in many continents in different parts of the world for centuries. It's embarrassingly simple, but I'm not ashamed because it works and it has this incredible impact, not just on nature, on landscapes, but on people's livelihoods. And so in those early years, this would have been 1983, how do we get this message across? And we found 10 willing volunteers in as many villages, and we asked, would you be willing to try this on a small corner of your farm? And they did that, and it was working. I was really encouraged, yes, this is going to make all the difference. However, there were needs in those villages. There were old scores to settle, and there were fears about breaking tradition. And it could have failed in 1983. People started to cut those trees down, and those 10 volunteers were getting very, very discouraged. And it could have failed then, but something happened that was totally beyond my control that just took over events. And in 1983, the rains failed, and people barely grew any food at all. Eventually, when we were able to get food, the government made a stipulation. If people are able-bodied, you're not to just give it out for free. People have to work for it. And that really worked into our hands, where we were able to create a Food for Work program requiring that people leave at least 40 of these trees per hectare on their farmland. But it was a very, very difficult time. It was one thing as a child to watch hunger on TV or read it in the papers, and yeah, it affected me emotionally, but you could turn the TV off and go straight to the fridge. They were unknown entities on the other side of the world. But by this stage, we'd been in the country 2.5 years. These were my friends. I'd slept in their huts, I'd eaten their food, and then reciprocated when they came to town, and they were suffering. Well, what do you say to them? Yes, Jesus loves you, but not in time of famine. We'll see you next year. You can't do that and stay in the country. And the longer into the drought that we got, the greater and greater pressure came to bear on us. And people started camping around our house, sleeping there at night in the hope they'd catch me in the morning on my way out and ask for food. And I distinctly remember one morning I was trying to eat my breakfast, but a lump was forming in my throat as I was thinking about these things. Tears were starting to come. And the Bible was open next to me on the table, and it was just randomly open there. But my eyes fell on this verse from 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 15. Fear not, and be not dismayed by this great multitude. And there really was a multitude building up outside. For the battle's not mine, not yours, but mine, says the Lord. And this sense of relief came over me. I didn't know what, I didn't know how or when, but I had a very, very strong conviction God was going to do something very dramatic. And, it was so bad. Ben's, my oldest son's here, it's so bad. I tried to get out to the car. I needed to get to the car. There were no phones back then to get to town and try and organise funding and grain and permissions. And I'd be wading through all these people. And then one morning, as I was trying to get out, I heard this great bellowing voice from behind me. Barashi Yawuchi, Bakashi Babaya Ravinci. There's Ben in perfect house yelling, "Let him get through. Didn't you hear him? He said he didn't have any food." And the crowd were just as amazed as I was and just parted like the parting of the waters, and I got through. But it was very, very difficult. We had no money. The organisation at that time, there's no reserve for relief. There was no grain in town. We'd gone to all the different merchants and there was no grain available. And importantly, as an expatriate and an external organisation working in the country, we had no permission and they had no intention of giving us permission. And then that prayer and that realisation God was going to do something very, very dramatic. Within 2 weeks, the governor of the district passed away. And the mayor, an old friend of the mission, was put in the interim in his place. And we went back to him to ask for permission. And within a week, he'd given us the permission. And I was a little bit amazed. And I was speaking to a friend of mine and said, how does that work? Nothing moves that quickly. And he was a bit of a joker. He said, "Are you kidding? He was probably scared you'd pray for him too." Now, I didn't pray for that. I just prayed for a transfer, but he got the big call. And over the next 6 to 8 months, we received $500,000 and were able to purchase 1,800 tonnes of grain and helped over 30,000 people. But the significance in this story, that again was the turning point where we used a tragedy to try to bring about the best possible outcome. Yes, people are suffering. How can we make the best of this situation to help them, but also to try and prevent it from ever happening again? And through that Food for Work program, we got beyond that first 10 individuals to work in 100 villages. And I had a captive audience for the best part of 8 months. At the end of that period, they'd left 500,000 trees. We counted them every month before we distributed food. They had a bumper harvest, and so we discontinued the food aid, and 75% of the people said, "Finished with that idiot Tony, we'll get on with our lives now," and they cut the trees out. But 25% said, "Yeah, he's a bit crazy, but leaving trees in our fields didn't do any harm, and in fact, we actually got a bumper crop this year. We're going to take it another year and see where that takes us." And they got to the end of the next year, still good harvest, plus the additional benefits, more fuel wood, wild foods, traditional medicines, richer soil, and so on. So many different reasons why we should have some level of tree cover on our farmland. So again, that was the start of this massive transformation in Niger that Tim talked about. Over the next 20 years, 200 million trees across 5 million hectares of farmland grew back on that land without planting a single one of them. And to say that it's a miraculous result is an understatement. The 10 years prior to the discovery of FMNR, $160 million were spent. They sort of restored around 20,000 hectares. If you do the sums, that's $8,000 per hectare. The 20 years following that discovery, much less than $10 million was spent, less than $2 per hectare. And with each subsequent year, because I'm not giving any input, Sim's not still funding this, it's simply spreading as an idea from farmer to farmer, that $2 figure is actually decreasing each year, and it's actually gone global. It's a very good investment. And so what? There are lots of numbers I've thrown around there. What's the significance? Think of the context. Niger is one of the poorest countries in the world, and in any case there's minimal, actually no government support. Many times they're more of a hindrance than a help. SIM itself, we didn't pour millions of dollars into this. That 10 million figure, that's including other organisations as well that came in later on. And yet, every year, without ongoing subsidy or external support, farmers in Niger are earning around $1,000 each year gross income, the value of what they consume plus what they sell. Across the 5 million hectares, that's about $900 million per year on the edge of the Sahara Desert, helping 4.5 million people every year, not through irrigation, not through fertilizer, not through improved seed, but because farmers are now working with creation instead of fighting it. Nigerian farmers are growing about 500,000 tonnes of grain, enough to feed 2.5 million people. So just a long way of saying it's actually really, really significant in terms of its impact. And I've had the privilege of returning to Niger in more recent years. Not only are people continuing this practice, they're built on that foundation. The soil's richer, there's greater biodiversity. They've been able to diversify the number of crops and animals, the types of crops and animals they grow, and new enterprises. Beekeeping is now possible. Some of those wild fruits, there are selected cultivars that we can top graft onto them and get an even better price for the produce. And because they're desert plants, without irrigation. So it continues, the blessing continues to have an impact. I joined World Vision in 1999 and I thought, this is wonderful. World Vision works in 100 countries around the world. All of them are impacted by deforestation to one degree or another. Let me at it. And it's just been the most incredible time. I'm glad Tim's not still CEO, because if he was, he would have stopped me. It's like every time we go back into these places where people have embraced this, it's party mode, Tim. People are clapping and dancing and celebrating, because if you put yourself in their shoes, what's it like to be a parent and you can't feed your children adequately or clothe them or send them to school? It's soul-destroying. What's it like to be a farmer and feel like you're not even on the first rung of the ladder? Nobody knows about you or cares about you. You're left to your own devices in a very, very hostile environment. And then this simple method comes along. Everything that you need to create the future that you want for yourself and your children, it's there at your disposal. It's very liberating and energizing for people. And as much as I love going back and I see nature returning, the biodiversity, the regreening of landscapes, yes, that's significant, that's what hits you immediately, but actually the biggest change that I see is the restoration of hope. It's powerful, the restoration of hope. And a community and an individual that's got hope is very, very different to a community that is in a hopeless situation. They'll invest in their kids' education. They'll take sensible risks to improve their agricultural methods and so on. And they'll build a better future for themselves and their children. And there's a quote here. I think I went to Ghana, northern Ghana, for the first time in 2011. And the community were almost at the point of breakup. Imagine not being able to support yourself from your farm. This is your inheritance, this is your ancestral land. Things had gotten so bad that they were considering leaving all of that and going to the capital city. And yet within 2 years they turned that around. From the winds becoming so strong, they regularly blew their roofs off. The switch, one year it would be a drought year, next year it would be a flood year because the whole ecosystem was out of sync. Children not in school, they were needed to help their families in the farming, in the collection of food and fuel wood and water. Within just 2 years, now the children were in school, the livestock had all the fodder that they needed and they had some of the best animals in the district. They had enough food to eat from their land and nobody was talking about going anywhere. And this old chief said, "This gift of Efimina is from the Almighty God, and therefore anywhere you visit, you bring life and joy." And this is the kind of sentiment that you receive wherever people have embraced this approach. It's just party mode, Tim. And I wish I could show you all these photos. So many people have contributed to this work. Somebody said, if you see a turtle on a fence post, you can be pretty sure that it didn't put itself there. And the real heroes of the story are the millions of farmers who took a risk on this. They were ridiculed and laughed at. They suffered loss through fire, through other people's livestock, through theft, and yet they persevered. Hundreds of field staff and colleagues here in the support countries working diligently at this. And I know many of the field staff personally. Often they live in rural areas away from their families. Because you're introducing change, it can be risky sometimes. People misunderstand. They threaten you at times. It's difficult, hard work. And people on this end working so hard to raise the funding, to design good programs that work, and to monitor how well they're going. And then international, I'd say, crusaders, working to change policies, working to influence donors, other non-government organisations and governments. So I hope you get the message. It's not Tony out there as the Lone Ranger regreening the whole world. So we're actually at a very critical point in history, and the United Nations Convention to Combat Climate Change, 2 years ago, they gave us just 10 short years to stop completely emitting greenhouse gases. So there's only 8 years left. And in addition, yes, we have to stop, but there's all this historical carbon dioxide up there as well that needs to be drawn down. And so what's predicted is more frequent, more severe storms, floods, droughts, and a consequence of that, there'll be more shortages of food and other natural resources, can lead to more conflict, unbelievable figures on the number of refugees that are expected globally, and so on and so forth. Really, really dismal predictions that I don't want to dwell on, because this is a story of hope. Yes, we have to stop the emissions. That's not what I do. What I do is reforestation. And what the experts estimate is there's 2 to 3 billion hectares of degraded forest and agricultural land out there that can support some degree of reforestation. Pure forests in some instances, agroforests and silvo-pastoral land in other instances. 2 to 3 billion hectares, and estimates vary, but if we were to restore that area, we could draw down anything from between 16 to 25% of existing greenhouse gases. We can have a tremendous impact. And so what do we need? 8 years left to get our act together. We need God's maths. 1 + 1 doesn't cut it anymore. Just simply adding projects, we'll never get there. 1 × 1 is still 1. We need God's mathematics. 1 + 1 = 11 or 22 or 44. That kind of impossible mathematics that goes beyond and above anything that we think or dream of. The sort of thing that happened in Niger, where even without our knowledge, this approach spread at a rate of 250,000 hectares per year for 20 years without our knowledge. But we need that on a global scale to restore these degraded lands. And I haven't been watching the time, Jackie. I hope I'm okay, but I'll just finish off with a little passage. So right from the end of the book, today I reflect on that boy in gumboots who yearned to plant trees on a barren hill. Feeling powerless, he reached out to a God of love and compassion and power. I see an earnest teenager and then a restless young man with Liz by his side, who took trusting but faltering steps and who found the faith to keep moving forward despite setbacks and disappointments. More significantly, my doubts faded with the experience of seeing God at work, the God who does care, who does answer prayer, and who does use very ordinary people to do extraordinary things. He's a God who has replaced despair, brokenness, and tragedy with hope, and hope through of all things trees. The lowly tree, despised, taken for granted, and abused by humankind from the dawn of time, ignored by scientists seeking technological fixes to problems of their own making, scorned by governments and industry in their blind pursuit of progress and prosperity, cut at the roots by the very farmers whose livelihoods and well-being depend on them. What more fitting symbol of hope than the humble and unsung tree which freely serves humanity in silence and forbearance and without fanfare? In the face of environmental destruction and injustice, my journey started with a child's prayer, asking God to use me somehow, somewhere to make a difference. I believe God honoured that prayer, and I'm in awe of how He has and is answering my prayer. And I'm grateful for the people who believed in me, supported me, encouraged, taught, and went before me. There is little room for doubt that God has indeed prepared in advance good things for us to do. Thank you. Here's the